Welcome back to Law and Crime Trial Network. We want to take you back live inside a Florida courtroom where, well, actually, it looks like the witness just stepped down. That was Jennifer Meadows, a neighbor who just described hearing gunshots the day of the shooting. She said she heard a gunshot while she was sitting at her kitchen table drinking coffee, then heard 5 or 6 more. She says that she couldn't see anything out of her window, but could tell that the shots came from behind her, the home behind her, which was Amanda Colley's house. We are now waiting to hear the next witnesses. So in the meantime, Brian Claypool, criminal defense attorney, still with me via Skype from Los Angeles. And Brian, the point I brought up right before the last break, that James and Amanda Colley have had 2 children together. There are 2 children still, 6 and 8, who are now in the custody of relatives. What do you make of the defense's point in the beginning of their opening statement? Why would he do this to his children? He loved his children. You know, why, if he was in his right mind, would he do this as a father?
Yeah, I think the evidence of James Colley having a family, having an estranged children that he still loves, that actually goes to the point I was making earlier in the show, which is here should be keep passion. This is a man that till the very end, Stacey, till the last moment, was trying to salvage his family, and then all of a sudden he had a loose gasket and he sprung. The problem I'm seeing in the defense is that there's a disconnect. We're hearing all this evidence about a family that he had, and it sounds like it's premeditated through the evidence we've heard so far. So, yeah. But we don't have Colley playing the part. After the shooting, he didn't say, "Oh, gee whiz, did I do this? I took a bunch of drugs and I can't believe I did."
Brian,
we don't even have that.
Brian, I'm going to cut you off there. Let's go back live into court where we have law enforcement up on the stand. Okay, looks like we lost the feed. See, that's how things change just on a dime like this when we have a live trial going on. We're getting ready to hear from Detective Samuel Delikat from the local police department there. Brian, I want to talk about something else in this case, which we haven't brought up yet, but what about the fact that after the shootings, James Colley took off? He wasn't found until hours later in Virginia. He made it from Florida to Virginia, and only then was he found because a woman called 911 because he was driving erratically on the highway. And when police apprehended him, they realized he was the guy wanted for these murders. So what does that tell us about his state of mind, if anything, if right after this happens, he runs, he's out of town?
That, to me, proves that this defense that his lawyers are using of this involuntary intoxication doesn't connect with his behavioral pattern. Because if this was somebody who was acting under the influence of all of these medications that caused him to do this, then why is he able to think out a plan to escape? He's making a conscious decision to flee, and that doesn't connect with this argument that he's under the influence of some medication. If he truly was impacted by medication, then he would have acted differently.
Right, and how could he drive that many hours on Ambien? That's a whole other thing. Let's go back live into court now where a detective is on the stand. Deputy Samuel Delikat of the St. Johns County Sheriff's Department in Florida, stepping down from the stand there. You just heard him describe the moments as he and others from the Sheriff's Department arrived at Amanda Colley's house on August 27th, 2015. He described how they were at the house, decided to go in as a team, and they saw there was a victim. As soon as they did, they entered aggressively. He also says that, talks about seeing some of the victims and the victims' bodies on the floor and so forth. Brian Claypool, criminal defense attorney, still with me here. And Brian, we're going to hear a lot of sort of detailed testimony about the crime scene, I would imagine, in law enforcement response over the next couple of hours and days, right?
Yeah, well, the prosecution wants to do that in a case like this because you've got a defendant trying to make an excuse for allegedly committing a horrific murder. So prosecution has to go through intimate detail of the police response, their protocol, to show, for example, how dangerous this crime scene was. You heard all the detail about setting up, a perimeter, slowly going toward the house. This wasn't some kind of, missing dog phone call where you just drive up to the house and knock on the door. was a very serious
Right,
call.
and they don't know if Colley's still inside or not and armed. I mean, that's always a risk for law enforcement when responding to any crime scene.
Absolutely, and that's what the prosecution wants to project to the jury, that this was a really dangerous, fluid criminal scene. And then you hear dramatic testimony from the deputy of actually finding Amanda. I was really moved by that testimony, because it's no longer, Stacey, about the opening statements you played earlier. This is about real live testimony now of a deputy doing his job and finding a beautiful young lady who's been hit by bullets on the floor.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the reality of this.
I agree, Brian. Thanks for that analysis. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with much more on the James Colley murder trial. Thanks for that, Anthony. Well, back to the big trial we are following out of Florida, the murder trial. It's a death penalty trial against James Colley. He is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and a long list of other lesser charges. The allegation is that back on August 27th, 2015, he went to his wife's house, his wife from whom he was separated, from a wife that he had a restraining order from. He was not supposed to be anywhere near her or approaching her. He was angry she had a new boyfriend. He was angry she hadn't been returning his calls. He showed up at her house looking for her new boyfriend with a gun. He ended up killing Amanda, his wife, and one of Amanda's best friends, Lindy Dobbins. Brian Claypool, criminal defense attorney, is still with me via Skype from Los Angeles, and we do appreciate that, Brian. We've been talking about the defense's strategy all day, and that's going to be to say that James Colley was on a bad mix of medications, Ambien, Cymbalta, Wellbutrin. He wasn't right in the head. But you're seeing a real disconnect, right, between some of the testimony we've heard and the facts that have been laid out versus this theory.
Yeah, Stacey, for sure. I mean, you heard the evidence today that clearly shows a young man who really was still trying to salvage his relationship with his estranged wife, despite this restraining order. He had kids with her. And I really believe that had his lawyer taken a different approach, which would be this: here's a guy who really to the bitter end held out hope of having this work out. He then goes to court, right? And then you and I talked earlier about this infamous phone call that he gets after court. And in fact, I think he had even made a call before court talking to Amanda about trying to, work things out. And then he gets a phone call after court, and then within 30 minutes after that phone call, he's over at that house. And then you just showed your viewers chilling testimony from a deputy about what went down. And then and then you made a great point earlier, he's then running away from the crime scene. That, to me, is way more consistent with somebody who was in the heat of the moment. It's called the heat of passion defense, where he found something out during that phone call that would have triggered a reasonable person, that's the standard, to go do what he did, because only 30 minutes went by. And to me, that would have connected all of this fury and rage that you're hearing about. Otherwise, when you bring in this involuntary intoxication, it just doesn't fly for me because of all of this aggressive, terrible behavior on his part. Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an interesting point, and we'll have to see whether or not it flies with the jury ultimately, right, Brian? But again, we are on a short break from court right now, and this is the first day of testimony. Prosecutors calling their witnesses still. We're not sure when the defense team will begin to talk about this involuntary intoxication theory. In the meantime, we want to go back to some testimony you may have missed while we were in commercial break, and that's testimony from Lamar Dubberly. He was Amanda Colley's boyfriend. He was at the home at the time of the shooting. In fact, it's very likely that he was the intended target of James Colley's rage. Let's go ahead and listen to how he describes those scary and chaotic moments when James entered the house with a gun. Okay, so that was some more testimony from Lamar Dubberly, Amanda Colley's boyfriend, who may have been James Colley's intended target. In fact, Brian Claypool, criminal defense attorney, still with me via Skype from Los Angeles. One thing before we go to break that we kind of spoke about before, and this is a death penalty case. So when we talk about the defense's theory, and their strategy here, is the goal here really just to save him from death? Because they're not disputing the fact that James Colley pulled the trigger. was there at the scene. They're not trying to say someone else did it.
Right, exactly. In opening statement, the defense lawyer has to make it clear that he or she is not asking the jury to excuse the defendant for this crime. In fact, you played it earlier. Defense lawyer said, hey, look, he committed the crime. But what you have to argue is that there were mitigating circumstances. And I think that should have been made a little bit more clear in opening statement.
Yeah.
That this man did the crime, but he didn't.
I got to cut you off again, Brian. I'm sorry. So ill-timed, these breaks. We'll be right back with much more. Stick around. Welcome back to Law and Crime Trial Network. I'm Stacey Delikat. In just a few minutes, court is going to resume in Florida in the James Colley murder case. In the meantime, Brian Claypool, criminal defense attorney, who's joining us, who's been with us all afternoon from Los Angeles, was making a good point before the break about mitigating factors and the role they will play in whether or not James Colley gets the death penalty. So why don't you continue on that point, Brian?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stacey. By mitigating factor, what I mean is the defense has to prove to the jury that Colley did not premeditate this murder. And the way they can do that, in other words, they're admitting he did it, but he should be charged with manslaughter and not first-degree murder and see the death penalty. Two ways to do it we've been talking about. One is the defense they're using, involuntary intoxication. The Ambien combined with the other drugs led him to do this. The other defense I think was better was the heat of passion defense, which you're using this to not make an excuse or excuse the murder, but just to say he didn't have the proper mindset to premeditate, therefore it's manslaughter.
And the defense, has an uphill battle in almost every murder case, it seems. But what else are they going to have to do besides just saying, he took Ambien, he took Wellbutrin, he took this and that, he wasn't himself? They're going to want to go out of their way to show that, perhaps he didn't have a criminal record, that we know there were some incidents that caused the judge to issue a restraining order against him from his wife.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a case like this, if you're the defense lawyer, you've got to try to squeeze in as many witnesses as you can, if the court permits, to talk about what kind of person Colley was, to talk about how good of a father he was and how much he cared about his family and is not a prior convicted felon, to try to humanize him as a person. Because think about it, Stacey, if you and I are in that jury panel, right, and we know nothing about this guy, and we're being told that he carried out this heinous act, it's pretty easy to jump to a conclusion that this guy is guilty of first-degree murder. But if you then hear some evidence during trial to personalize him as a human being, that he really was struggling and grappling with what was happening and unfolding in his life, maybe some jurors could possibly relate to that inner turmoil that he was struggling with.
Yeah, I mean, it will certainly be interesting to see how they do make their case. Brian, thanks for that and all of the analysis you've given us this afternoon. While we wait for court to come back in session, we are going to go back to some other riveting testimony from this morning. That is testimony of one of the surviving victims in this case, Rachel Hendricks, surviving witness. She was there at the time James Colley opened fire, killing Amanda and her friend Lindy. In fact, her arm was grazed by a bullet. Let's listen more to her testimony.